There are definitely some good moments in the first half of the fourth season of Wings. Up until this point, I have been discussing episodes individually, but then I realised it's going to take me such a long time to get through them, and I don't always have that much to say about individual episodes. So I decided going forward, I'm going to group them, and I'll probably review half a season at a time. I've already reviewed episode 1 of the fourth season, so I'm currently, or today, going to be discussing episodes 2 to 11, and I'll just go through them, talk a little bit about what the episodes involve, share some highlights, and also whether there are any negatives. And we start off with The Fortune Cookies, directed by Andy Ackerman, and this one I remembered really well from the first time that I watched this quite a few years ago now. And this is obviously in the aftermath of the previous episode, and obviously Joe's plane has been damaged and the insurance isn't covering it. So Brian told Joe to fake an injury for the insurance claim, which I don't love as a concept, but I do like how it played out. Highlights here. I did find Joe's response very believable once he found out the premium was being raised because of the accident, and that was enough for Joe to realise maybe I should fake the injury. Again, I don't agree with it, but it was an interesting part of the episode. Brian pretending to be Joe, I thought was a risk, but I really enjoyed how that played out, and Susan coming in to evaluate the claim and then stripping, I thought was, I think definitely I could remember it, but I feel like it would have been a very unexpected part of the episode, and I thought that all worked out really well. The ending, though, I don't want to say the ending is a negative, but I do think it just fell a little bit flat. I feel like the ending kind of fizzled out a little bit, so it wasn't the strongest end to the episode, but in general, The Fortune Cookies was not too bad at all. The third episode is Noses Off. This is directed by Andy Ackerman. And Joe ends up in hospital because somebody punched him thinking he was Brian, and Brian goes with him to the hospital, and the doctor happens to mention that he could also do a quick procedure on Brian and just get rid of that little bump on Brian's nose. And suddenly Brian becomes paranoid about this bump on his nose, and he wants this perfect nose. And what I really like about this is that Brian is a man. And I feel like they absolutely could have done a story with Helen and said, oh, women are so obsessed with their appearance, and gone down a very stereotypical route. But they didn't. They used Brian. And Brian, I don't want to say Brian doesn't care about his appearance, but I don't think it's his greatest thought. I don't think he spends the most time worrying about his appearance. And here we have somebody planting that seed of doubt, and that's all it took for him to question his appearance. And I really liked that. I thought they really took a good direction with that. And what I also liked is Joe's little speech to Brian. He was they were both looking in the mirror, and Brian obviously feels imperfect, but Joe was pointing out that he has their mother's nose and their father's eyes. So even though he may not love those things about himself, he starts to obviously question everything. They were gifts from his parents. They were little bits of his parents connecting him to them. And I thought that was a really sweet way to look at it. And then Brian makes Joe sing the turtle song, which was very unexpected. I couldn't remember that bit from when I last watched the episode. And definitely found that to be very amusing. And no negatives. There wasn't anything about this that I thought was badly done or just not very well executed. Not a bad episode at all. We then come to Blackout Biggins, the fourth episode, directed again by Andy Ackerman. And this is another one that I remembered really well. Roy gets the chance to sing the national anthem when the Red Sox are playing, and I rather enjoyed that part of it quite a lot. And he ends up blacking out, and this becomes a meme, and he gets known as Roy Blackout Biggins because they got his name incorrect, which I thought was just adding insult to injury. I rather liked that. I thought it was great, and Roy gave a really great vocal performance as well, so I really thoroughly enjoyed that. We also have a subplot where Faye made a mistake that cost Joe $500, and they referred to it as a bonehead mistake, which I think is a little bit mean. It wasn't my favourite part of the narrative, but it was fine. But I did enjoy Antonio's poem. He wrote a poem called Waiting for a Fare, which I quite liked. So several highlights here. The main narrative I really enjoyed, and no negatives at all. We we then come to the fifth episode, Mathers of the Heart, as in Lowell Mathers, and this is directed by Andy Ackerman. And Lowell goes on a date with Helen. Helen agrees because she felt bad for making him feel bad. When he first asked her out, her response was, well, she was baffled why he would ask her out, and she had not the nicest of responses, so she goes on this date. And I loved how this played out because Lowell didn't have a good time. Helen had a surprisingly good time, and Lowell thought that she was boring. And it wasn't the direction I was expecting it to take. I thought it was a very well-written part of the narrative, and another bit that I quite enjoyed, and I thought it was very obvious, but near the beginning, Lowell is describing this kiss he had with Helen. And I thought it was very obvious that it was a dream, but I enjoyed watching everybody else's reactions. The only thing that I didn't like about this, or didn't agree with, is that Joe and Helen kiss at the end of the episode to kind of prove there's no spark between them. And it does prove that, but I don't agree with that. Because I think Joe and Helen have this underlying spark and they just refuse to admit it. So I didn't, it's not that it's bad within the episode, but it's not what I wanted to see. But in general, not a bad episode. Episode 6 is Two Jerks and a Jill. This is directed by David Lee and Andy Ackerman, and Joe and Brian are competing for Alex's attention. Alex is played by Farrah Fawcett. She's a helicopter pirate, and they both want to date her. And we also have a subplot with Antonio joining Lowell to shoot rats at the dump. And Antonio ended up doing really well and showing Lowell up in front of his Tuesday night rat club. It was a decent part of the narrative. I didn't mind it too much. I did like the story with Alex. I don't know how I feel about Alex as a character, but I liked how it played out. And I thought the gym scene was very well done. And they went there because they wanted to bump into Alex. Brian wanted to bump into Alex, which I thought was a nice way to take it. And I loved when Alex said, "I really only find one of you attractive." Which one, though? That's the big question. And I thought she played things very, very well. Also, Faye mentioned Annie Get Your Gun to compare Antonio's situation. Great film. Really, really liked that reference. And no negatives. Nothing bad about Two Jerks and a Jill either. Episode 7. It's So Nice to Have a Mather Around the House. This is directed by David Lee. And this is another one that I remembered really, really well. Brian accidentally sank Lowell's boat. And as soon as that was said, my immediate thought was, hang on, that's his house. He has a houseboat. So obviously, Lowell gets to stay with Brian and Joe. And they really like having him there. He's cooking them a lot of food. It's a really nice environment with Lowell around. And the insurance company check arrives. And obviously they don't want to give this to Lowell because he'll move out. So they decide to hide it. And I really enjoyed how this played out. And we get to see Lowell getting increasingly bossy, which I thought was quite fun. And I absolutely loved how Lowell played it when he presented the check to them, having found where they'd hidden it. I thought that was very entertaining as well. We also have a subplot with Antonio. His uncle makes gloves. So Antonio traces everybody's hands and faxes it over to his uncle so that they can get some custom-made gloves, which is quite sweet. And unfortunately, the sketches of their hands, or the tracing of their hands, became enlarged, and the gloves were giant. It's fun. I enjoyed it. A nice bit of padding for the main narrative, and no negatives either. Nothing wrong with this episode. I rather enjoyed it. Episode 8, Just Say No, directed by Andy Ackerman. We have Terry Austin playing Shannon Moss, an old friend, and Brian is obsessed with her. And he can't say no to her. He does everything she asks. And for me, the only real highlight was Brian's response when Shannon cancelled their plans and basically took advantage of him. But honestly, the negative for this is that it's just not a very interesting episode. I have nothing else to say. It's not bad, but I didn't care for it. I didn't think Just Say No was very interesting. Episode 9, It May Have Happened One Night, directed by Andy Ackerman. And this one I thought was really good fun. Antonio saw Joe's car outside of Alex's apartment, And the big question on everybody's mind is, did Jo sleep with Alex? This happened because she had a bit of a sob story about an ex-boyfriend, so Jo agreed to go back to her place and comfort her and just make her feel better. And I thought it worked really well, and I really thoroughly enjoyed how that played out. I really liked Alex's attitude, and I particularly liked the point that Brian asks Jo outright, did you sleep with Alex? And Jo pointed out that Brian wouldn't believe him either way. If he said yes, he'd say you're lying. If he said no, he'd say you're lying, which I thought was a very valid point. And what I didn't expect with this, and what I couldn't remember, is that Alex couldn't remember. She'd had so much to drink, she couldn't remember that they'd slept together. And I thought that was quite interesting, but also interesting that she didn't really make a big deal out of not even remembering if she'd slept with Jo. I feel like that should have been a bigger deal than it was. But I enjoyed the way the narrative progressed. And we then also have a nice bit at the beginning where Faye read out a letter that was meant to be negative, but there was a positive comment about the lady at the counter, so it's all good. I enjoyed this episode. I thought it may have happened one night, worked really, really well. And then episode 10, The Customer's Usually Right, is another one that I love, and it's got what I consider to be a fun twist in it. This is directed by Leonard R. Garner Jr., and it's set at Christmas. And the main narrative focuses on the fact that Jo got a 50-cent rewind fee because he took a video back to the rental store and he hadn't rewound it, so he got charged for it. And he is determined to get that 50 cents back. And he goes down to the store, and I love the environment. I love when films and shows are set in rental stores, because I just love looking at the shelves. I just love looking at what films are there, and I think it's really great fun, and this really came across. And in general, I thought the episode was well handled. Personal highlights: the costumes look great. Faye has a rather delightful wreath shirt to keep in with the festive feeling. I like the fact that Roy asked Antonio to spend Christmas with him and his mother. I thought that was rather sweet. And well, Lowell and Roy's face when Faye ended up playing the drums off screen, but it worked well. And I also loved the surprise, because we find out that actually the video hadn't been rewound. And this is because Lowell had watched it. Jo had finished it, he'd rewound it, and then Lowell saw the VHS sitting out, so he decided to watch it without telling Jo, and he didn't rewind it. And of course, Jo didn't know about this, so he assumed it was still rewound. And I thought that was a nice, fun little twist. And I'll come back to another personal highlight in a moment, because I have to explain a negative before I explain that positive. There are only two negatives. One, the Christmas decorations are terrible. In the airport, it looks like moss. It just is appalling. But Helen's gingerbread house was cute, so it balances out. And the other thing I didn't like, but it makes sense for the episode, is the treatment of Debbie. Debbie is a very sweet elderly lady who is responsible for handling the VHSs that need to be rewound. And she goes to give Jo the money back from her own purse or from her own pocket, and she ends up in hospital because of the stress of the situation and getting fired. And I just felt really uncomfortable with that, and I really didn't like it. But what I did like is that Jo, feeling guilty and responsible, goes to the hospital. And it's Christmas, of course, and when he gets there, Debbie's family is just surrounding her bedside, and it's so lovely to see all of that support. And Jo talks with Debbie at her family's insistence. And just as she wakes up, Jo leaves, because obviously he doesn't want her to recognise him. And her family think that he must have been an angel who disappeared just as she woke up. He'd been sent from heaven to serve that purpose. And they hear a little tinkling of a bell. And they think that Jo must have got his wings for doing this good deed, which I just thought was really sweet. It was really adorable, and I rather liked that part. So I don't like what happened with Debbie for the most part, but that ending there was very, very sweet. And the last episode for this batch is episode 11, Exit Laughing. It's directed by Andy Ackerman. And this is another one I remembered really well because of the character of Connor. Connor is played by Stephen Eckholt. He's Jo's friend, and Helen decides to go on a date with him. Jo doesn't really want her to date him. She doesn't really know why, but she, I guess because she wants to prove that she can date whoever she wants, she goes on this date with him, and they go to the cinema, and it seems like it's going really well. And they're watching a comedy, and he laughs a lot in a way that's very unique. And we also have a subplot with Antonio having a leaf blower problem with a neighbour, which I thought was quite relatable if you have noisy neighbours. That part of the narrative, I didn't mind. I thought what Roy did with that was interesting. It was fine as padding. But the main narrative itself was quite interesting as well. And we have this really interesting suggestion from Helen where she suggests that the reason Joe doesn't want her to date Connor is because Joe's still not over her. And I agree with that. And I agree completely. And I think Helen's not over him either. But as I said a couple of episodes ago, they had a kiss to prove there was no spark. And it did kind of show there was no spark. So I don't know. At this point in the show, I don't love how they're handling the relationship. And we have a great discussion as well about annoying habits and whether it's possible to overlook them in a relationship, or how annoying does it have to be for it to be a deal breaker. Should somebody's laugh be enough to turn you away from them? Obviously, after one date, it's not a big deal, but let's say you're in a committed relationship and then, I don't know, you move in together, for example, and you suddenly find out they have a weird, annoying habit. How much of it should be a deal breaker? I just thought it was a really interesting concept, and it made me think. And ultimately what happens is Connor breaks up with Helen. Well, I doubt we can really say breaking up. They've been on one date, but he decides to put an end to it because she has an annoying accent, which I don't agree with. I don't for a second think she has an annoying accent, whereas his laugh really did stand out. But I like the fact that it showed that actually people can annoy people in different ways, and it's not just all one-sided. So, not a bad episode, not a bad way to win. This batch, no negatives at all. Exit laughing. Is a pretty good episode. Looking forward to rewatching the second half of season 4 of Wings, and needless to say, I thought episodes 2 to 11, generally a couple of weaklings, but for the most part, it's a pretty decent batch of episodes.